Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caitlin DeParty, and I'm the project manager for the Bureau of Justice Assistance Crime Analyst in Residence Program. I'd like to welcome you all to the Crime Analyst in Residence Program webinar titled Accelerate Your Compstat. We're thrilled to have you with us today as we explore how to automate crime statistics using Microsoft Access and Excel. Throughout today's session, we encourage you to engage, take notes, and share your thoughts. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat or Q&A, and I will answer as many as I can during the presentation. And Charlie Gibberti, who is one of our CAR subject matter experts, will also assist in answering questions during the presentation. Amanda will do her best to answer the rest of them at the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, crimeanalystinresidence.com, for anybody who would like to review it later. At the conclusion of the webinar, you'll receive a short evaluation form. It just takes about 5 minutes to complete, and your feedback is incredibly valuable in helping us improve future sessions. We really appreciate any input that you can provide. We are excited to continue offering these learning opportunities, and we're already looking forward to our next webinar, which will be in July. So please stay tuned for more details on that. Thank you for joining us today. So let's get started. Amanda, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Caitlin. And to get us started, I do just kind of want to take a second to introduce myself. So my name is Amanda Bruner. I am a crime analysis advisor for the CNA Corporation. I've been with CNA for about 3 years. Prior to that, I started the crime analysis program at the Matthews Police Department in North Carolina. And prior to that, I was an intelligence specialist with Bank of America. Outside of my full-time role as a crime analysis advisor with CNA, I do teach crime analysis for a few universities, including Radford University and UNC Charlotte, and then we'll be supporting the instruction of practical skills for crime analysts at Mount St. Mary's and hopefully Michigan State University in the upcoming semesters. I'm also the outgoing president of the Carolinas Crime Analysis Association, and I'm excited to get started today with Accelerate Your Compstat. Bear with me one moment, though. Let's see if we can get this to switch over. Okay, perfect. All right, so to start off with, I do want to talk briefly about some of the disadvantages of manual data processing. So here on the screen, I have a screen recording of the Southern Software RMS. And this is not to pick on Southern Software by any means. They've actually been really great to work with from an analyst perspective. But this is an example that's comparative to any other RMS system out there on the market of how you might get data out of the front end if you're looking for a simple statistic. So in this case, I'm searching shoplifting between a date range, not unfounded, and my results are outputted as a PDF. That entire process obviously takes several minutes to put in, and all we got out of that was one number. We're not actually getting any data that we can analyze for trends or anything else. And this is another example, some different canned reports that you might be able to get out of your front end of your RMS or CAD system. But again, some of these systems are only outputting for a particular date range. Maybe you have Excel, otherwise they're oftentimes PDFs, and it's not something where we can transform this easily into a bar chart, a Power BI dashboard, an Excel Compstat sheet that we're going to be working on today, or anything of the like. So the big focus here is how do we streamline this process as an analyst? So this is a proposed solution. This is actually a product that we worked with the Fuquay-Varina Police Department to create. Their analyst, Lindsay Pluso, had previously been extracting data from the front end, just like many analysts across the nation. What we were able to do was to utilize the template that we're actually also going to provide during today's webinar and automate the production of their biweekly and monthly crime stats. So this is the proposed solution that we're going to be creating today. Just as a little bit of overview information, we have our index offenses here that's customizable to the agency. You could look at Group A offenses under NIBRS. You could look at just a subset of offenses. It's entirely up to you. The template is able to be modified. And then we're looking at the previous 14 to the current 14 days with a percent change, previous 28 to the current 28 with a percent change, the current 28 days last year and the year prior to that, and then year to date for the last 3 years with those comparisons. Again, the concept for today is really to go through how this was created and then to hopefully be able to support you all in applying this at your own agency and modifying it accordingly. So the automation process is essentially that we are going to connect to a sample RMS database to the back end of it using Microsoft Access to kind of do a very introductory lesson in SQL. We'll be using the query design tool in Microsoft Access, and then we'll be linking those queries over to Microsoft Excel. So this process does not employ the usage of the front end of the records management system. The first step is to link Microsoft Access to the SQL Server database for your records management system or CAD or any other database that your agency utilizes. In order to do this, we utilize what's called an ODBC connection or Open Database Connectivity. From there, you're most likely going to require assistance from your IT department, your RMS vendor in order to establish that. We are very big advocates with the CAR program for analysts having access to backend data. About 2/3 of analysts or more across the United States currently do not have access to the backend of their systems, and that ultimately impacts the workflow for analysts. It increases the ability or increases the need rather for having to compile reports manually rather than being able to institute automation. So once that ODBC is established, typically that is a very simple thing to set up. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes. However, it is generating buy-in and having those discussions with IT and command staff to get the permissions to begin with that often take a little bit more time. But nonetheless, once that ODBC is established, we're able to open up Microsoft Access and then click new data source from database and then from the SQL Server to input some of those credentials. From in here, you have two options. You can either import data from the database. That would just be a one-time copy. We do run into some issues there when it comes to data size. So the best option is to choose to link so that you have a two-way connection. This is going to basically synchronize changes in access to the database. So for example, if a report is active and then that status changes to closed, that's going to be reflected in the linked data set. Likewise, if a report was an aggravated assault with a 13A, and then ultimately an individual succumbed to their injuries, and that was changed to a 09A homicide, again, with that linked connection, it's going to show those updates. So what this is going to do is it's going to give us a live view of the tables within the database, and then from there, we'll build the analytical product. As a bit of review for those on the call, we do have a slide here that just kind of talks about data structure. So this is a view of a sample backend of an RMS system. On the left, you'll see a variety of different tables, and then one of those tables is open in the center of your screen. So ultimately, the database is a collection of information related to a particular subject. The best use case for that when we talk about this perspective is records management system, CAD system, jail management system, so forth. Within that database, we have a variety of different tables, and then we utilize queries to find and retrieve data from those tables. We won't talk about forms and reports today, but those are other ways in which you can help streamline your analytical workflows. So when we talk about the database and trying to create queries, we have to recognize the spreadsheet problem. So here I have a graphic on the screen that's kind of going through what if we just used an Excel spreadsheet for our RMS, where we had report date, time, location, and so forth, and we just kept adding columns. Well, at some point, we're going to need to have offense 1, offense 2, offense 3, 4, etc. We could have an unlimited number of offenses on any given report. Likewise, we could have an unlimited number of suspects on any given report. So it started as a very simple spreadsheet, our mock RMS. It's ultimately getting larger and larger. And so what we end up having to do is put these into separate tables where we're going to have an incident table, an offense table, a suspect or names table, and so forth, where each incident is represented on a line. Each offense is represented on a line, so a row rather than a column. So ultimately, within our database, we have a series of different tables. Today, we'll be using our incident and our offense table, but we have to be able to join those tables together in order to get all of the information we need. So we're going to end up creating a join between our incident and our offense table. And in this sample here on the screen, I also have a suspect table just for representation purposes. Now, when we talk about data relationships, I have on the screen here the incident offender, and the incident offense. This is the view in Query Designer in Microsoft Access when we go to build a query. These lines represent the joins between those tables. We have different types of joins, and today I just want to touch on one-to-one and one-to-many. So if we have a one-to-one join, that means that each record in the first table can only have one matching record in the second table. That is typically represented as an incident to a location table. So for example, every incident report only has one incident location on it. Sometimes that address information is stored in a separate table. For this example today, we're going to be talking about a one-to-many connection. And that is the type of connection that we would see here between incident and incident offender, and between incident and incident offense, where each record in the first table, in this case incident, can have many matching records in the second table, in this case offender or offenses. So we're representing here how one incident report could have multiple offenses on it. There could be multiple vehicles stolen, and so there may be more than one 240 associated with that incident report. The process for the analytical workflow that we're going to be creating counts offenses in accordance with NIBRS. So we will be counting all of the offenses that are on those incident reports. And then this is just another example, kind of again to belabor the point here, of a relational database. So on the first table, I have basically what might be a master name table, where it has first name, last name, social, and person ID. There's going to be another table in the RMS that's going to have a master vehicle table that's associated with owner ID. But we can join based on person ID to owner ID, and then that would return that I own different vehicles. We're going to be doing the same thing, but again, between incidents and incident offenses. Before we jump into actually building the query in Microsoft Access, I do want to point out that there is a QR code up on the screen that I recommend you select. There'll also be a link at the end where you can have these slides. And like Caitlin mentioned, there will be a recording, so you can always come back to this. But this is an example resource from Microsoft that breaks down different query criteria for the query design tool in Microsoft Access. So for example, in here, if we're going to exactly match a value, we're going to put it in quotes. We don't want to match the value, we'll put not in front of it. If it's containing a specified string, we'll offset that with asterisks in the quotes, match one of two values, or and so forth. So these on the screen are kind of some of the most common ones that an analyst is going to use, and covers the variety of different query criteria we may be using during today's webinar. Otherwise, again, I recommend going to the QR code on the screen that's going to open up into the Microsoft query page that's going to break down all of the most common criteria when utilizing Microsoft Access. So our first thing here is to build a query in Design View. So I'm going to actually open up the two different tables. So I've opened up Query Designer, and now I'm selecting my two tables. So I'm selecting incident and incident offense. You'll see here that it's automatically joined these two based on the incident number field, which is fine. Otherwise, if we didn't have that there, we could select and actually drag and drop to make our join. Then from there, I'm just going to double click the fields I want to appear below. This is what's going to be in my results or my table. So I'm having incident number, I want all of them. For incident date, I have a date range I'm putting in here, which is greater than or equal to 1/1/2019 and less than or equal to today. Today is represented as date and an open and closed parentheses. You could have a different option there where you could make it dynamic and just say date minus 365 for 1 year of data. So you have a couple different options there. For case status, I'm not going to include unfounded. And for offense code, I'm going to have an or statement with my property offenses. Again, you could bring everything in. Just for today's example, I've narrowed it down to limit the data size that I'll be working with. From there, you're able to actually view the table itself. You can also view the SQL behind this if you prefer to actually see the actual SQL statement. And at any point in time, we can save this query and then reopen it up to see that table of data. So again, this is just a very basic way to get started with that standard query. At this point, we have our query results that are in the table in Microsoft Access, but we need to bring that data into Microsoft Excel. In order to do this, I'm going to link that query. So at this point, I'm going to get data. I'm selecting the database that has that query in it. In this example, it's called ad hoc. And then that Bruner query is the one that I'm bringing in. So I'm actually going to link that. I'm going to load it. You can open Power Query at this point if you needed to transform any of those fields. Then that's going to come in under Queries and Connections. That is going to be a live connection since we linked it in there. You can just click refresh to bring in new data at any point in time. So if tomorrow happens and you want to bring in new data to update your stats, you would just simply refresh that query and it's going to bring in that new data. All right, so today's template that I'm going to break down the formulas for is a modified version of the complete template. We're just going to be looking at some of the property offenses. And again, we're looking at some of our part 1 property offenses specifically. And so this is the template that's the same time frame as I mentioned on the original from Fuquay Marina, but then ultimately the other cells are blank at this point in time. So we're going to go through how we can create these formulas, how we can copy and paste to make it a little bit easier to navigate. And within the next short while, we'll be able to complete this template using a series of different formulas. Hopefully this is review that a formula is a script that produces an output based on the data. You may have used sum, average, if, month, and so forth, your normal analytical processes. But what's going to really help us today is the color coding that we have in Microsoft Excel that's going to help reference different columns, different cells, and so forth. So just as a very basic overview here, but we're about to dive into a couple different formulas. So the first one we're using is a standard sum. So I'm just entering an equal sign, the word sum, and then I'm going to select burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson. All I'm doing here is I'm adding together that my property offenses are going to equal the sum of the subcategories. I can then copy that sum over and I can paste it into my other columns. I'm pasting the formula there. And so now we can see we've already completed almost one row of our template. The second use of the sum formula here is going to be summing up our 23A through 23H offenses. So our pocket picking through all other larceny, that's going to all add together to equal our larceny and theft category. Again, I'm copying this over into the subsequent columns and pasting that formula accordingly. So that formula is going to continue to refer to those new columns. The next piece of this focuses on the fact that our final Excel spreadsheet is going to be date dynamic. What that means is all of the formulas that we're about to use are going to refer to one cell to build a date range. We will be utilizing $ for absolute cell and column references, which allows us to copy and paste formulas more efficiently. And you do have several options for your date dynamic cell. And so when I refer to the date dynamic cell, that's basically the end date of our date range that the stats cover. So you have a couple options. Some analysts may choose to just have their date dynamic cell equal today. Now you will notice the formula for today in Excel is the word today, whereas in Microsoft Access, it was the word date, just something to be aware of. The example today that we're going to be using looks at the previous Saturday. And so the formula there is today, and then it's looking for the 7th day, the most recent 7th day of the week, so the most recent Saturday. You could also just type in a date if you wanted. So if at any point in time you build your automated stat sheet and you wanted to see the stats as of December 31st of last year, you can just change your date dynamic cell to 12/31/24. If you wanted to have these stats on a Monday and again on a Tuesday, you can again type that date in, or you could use a today function. There's a variety of different options, but the primary takeaway here is that our stat sheet is all going to refer and be based off of that date dynamic cell. All of our date ranges that we're looking at are going to be referring back to that date dynamic cell. In order to utilize that, we're going to be using a series of COUNTIF formulas. COUNTIF counts the number of cells that meet a criterion, so based on values in corresponding columns. So there's pairs for columns and values. Basically what COUNTIF does is it says, go look here and find this. So it's going to say, you look in the column and then you find a value. And then we just repeat that over and over. So we use COUNTIF, which is singular for single conditions. So we only have one condition we want to meet. And we use COUNTIFs for multiple conditions. So that's what we'll be using today when we're looking for both an offense and a date range. If we just wanted to find all of the burglaries in our data set, it would just be COUNTIF. But if we have, again, those multiple conditions, we would be using countifs, plural. Now, this is the countif formula for burglaries for the previous 14-day time period. This uses C23 as the date dynamic cell, so our end of period date. However, this formula is quite lengthy, quite complex, but I'm going to go through step by step here to break it down to make it a little bit easier to understand. So first we start with an equal sign. We're just starting just like any other formula. We're using countifs because we have multiple conditions. You'll notice in here that we ultimately have 3 different conditions. We have an offense code, 220 for burglary. We have an upper date boundary and a lower date boundary. So we have 3 different conditions, so we're using countifs, plural. The first thing that we're going to do, our first condition for our countif, is going to be telling Excel what column we want to look in first. In this case, it's going to be our offense column. So on the data that we just brought in for Microsoft Access into Microsoft Excel, we're first going to select the column in that data that contains the offense codes. So we're telling it where to look first. Then we're telling it what we want to find. In this case, we're looking for burglary. However, it's represented in the data that I brought in with the NIBRS code of 220. I'm putting that in quotes. So at this point in time, we've told Excel to look on the data tab, look in column D, which is our offense column, and I want to only have the rows that contain 220. It's going to be counting how many of those there are. Now we want to have a second condition. We're going to tell Excel again where we want to look. This time we're selecting the date column on our data sheet. And then we're also going to be selecting our date column. We then have our lower date boundary. What we're saying is we've already isolated down to just burglaries, but now we only want burglaries that occurred on a date that is greater than or equal to our date dynamic cell minus 27. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got that 27 number here in a moment. But the takeaway here is that this is our lower date boundary. C23 is our date dynamic cell. So we're saying we want all of the burglaries that occurred on or after our date dynamic cell minus 27 days. As a reminder, we're looking at our previous 14-day time period. So we're actually basically going 28 days away from today. The third criteria that we're going to have here is our upper date boundary. Again, we're going to go into our data sheet and we're selecting our date column, same as what we just did, but now we're saying only have those that have a date that's less than or equal to our date dynamic cell minus 14. So again, the upper date boundary. So at this point, we've basically told Excel, go to the data tab, isolate down burglaries, isolate them down further if they occurred on or after 28 days ago, and isolate them down again a third time if they're less than the date range was less than or equal to the date dynamic cell minus 14. Now, this is kind of where I get those numbers from. This is a sample month. Again, the breakdown there of that formula was looking at the previous 14 days for burglary. So if I'm basing my stats off of the concept where they're ending on a Saturday at midnight, so potentially the 27th of the sample month, the current 14-day time period, that time range would be minus 13 as the lower date boundary up until C23 or today or the previous Saturday, again, whatever you want as the end of that. For our previous 14-day time period, it's going to be minus 27 up until minus 14. That's how basically we're taking that date dynamic cell and subtracting days from it to create the date range. So on this sheet here, I have those represented at the right, but I'm going to break down and actually put in our first countifs formula here. So I have an equal sign, countifs. I'm on my data sheet. I'm selecting my offense column. I've entered 220. I'm selecting my date column. I'm saying greater than or equal to. I'm about to go select my date dynamic cell back on my template sheet. And then I'm going to go back one last time, select my date column one more, and then put in my final criteria. As I mentioned, I have the previous 14, current 14, previous 28, and current 28 breakdowns with those date ranges at the right. So we know if we're doing previous 14, it's going to be minus 27, and then the other is going to be minus 14. So if you can see, it's a bit small in my formula bar. I'm typing in here my date dynamic cell, and I'm about to subtract -14 from that, and that's going to complete my upper date boundary. So I've completed those 3 criteria. I'll close my parentheses, I'll press enter, and it's automatically counted the number of burglaries that occurred. I'm then going to copy and paste this over, or rather down the column here. I'm pasting that formula because it's representative of that same date range, that previous 14 days. Now here, I'm just simply going to delete out the 220 criteria, the specific offense code I was looking at. I'm going to replace that with the NIBRS code associated with these other descriptions. So I'm just deleting out 220 and typing 23C or 23H or whatever the associated NIBRS code is. Now, if you had a column in here that had all of your NIBRS codes in that, you could simply refer to that column in your formula as well, rather than typing the text directly into the formula bar like I'm doing in this example. But nonetheless, either way in which you choose to do it, we used one formula, we've copied and pasted it down the row, and we have basically completed our previous 14-day range. From there, I would just copy over to the right to my current 14, my previous 28, my current 28, and so forth. I'm going to copy over the same formula for that. I'm just going to modify my date range. Then I'm going to copy it down the column and modify the offense codes. If you complete that step 3 times over, you'll have completed all 4 of those. So you'll have the previous 14, the current 14, and the previous and current 28 days completed as shown here on the template. Typically, LC analysts will say, let's go to the current 28 of the previous year next. However, we're actually going to skip ahead to the last series of columns, our year to date first, and then we'll come back to looking at our 28-day time period of the previous years. So we're skipping ahead over into what is the yellow section on this template, which is our current year to date. This data is simulated, and so it is from 2022. So 2022 is considered our current year in this example. In order to do this, we're going to be using a nested function, which is just basically putting a function into a formula. So we're having ultimately multiple things that are all referring to different formulas. It's going to build out. For our year to date piece of this, our lower date boundary is going to become at January 1 of the current year or January 1 of whatever is in that date dynamic cell for further explanation. We're going to be utilizing the date function that encompasses year, month, and day. So again, we'll be starting out with our original formula. I don't want to have to go select all of those columns all over again. I'm going to paste that into my 2022 year-to-date column, and I'm deleting out my lower date boundary. Again, my lower date boundary here needs to be January 1 of the year that's in the date dynamic cell. So I'm using that date function. I then have year. I'm selecting the year from my date dynamic cell. I'm then going to select 1 and 1 representing January 1st. So that's going to be the first of that year up until, and then because it's a year to date cell that we're trying to ultimately create here, I'm then going to just have my upper date boundary be C23, again, my date dynamic cell. So I'm selecting year from C23, but this time we're also want month from C23 and day from C23. So what this shows is it says go from 1/1 of that year to that day. And then again, we're counting burglaries still in this case, and then we'll close out our parentheses and it's going to give us our year to date range. Again, just like before, you can copy and paste that down the column. In order to complete for the other offense codes, all you have to do then is modify the offense code that's in the formula. Next, I'm going to complete the 2021 year to date, which would be kind of considered the previous year, and then the 2020 year to date, which would essentially be 2 years prior. In order to do that, we're going to use almost an identical formula to what we just did for 2022 year to date, but now instead of just having the year, we're going to have the year -1 for 2021 and the year -2 for 2020. Now, again, as a reminder, my end of period is in 2022. So if you were doing this on today's data, your date ranges are obviously going to look a little bit different. The formulas are the exact same. So I'm copying over from my 2022 year-to-date cell, pasting that into 2021 year-to-date. I'm opening up that formula, and all I'm going to enter here is a -1 for that year to date. And then I'm going to have the date dynamic cell, the year from that also -1. And it's as simple as that. I can copy that over one more time over into my 2020 column or my 2 years prior if you're working with regular data. And instead of -1, it's simply going to be -2. So it's looking at 2 years prior. And then just like I've said multiple times, you can copy those new things down the column, and then you'll be able to just again modify your offense codes in those formulas. The last section of date ranges within this template looks at the previous year time period. So we're looking at our current 28-day range, but we're looking at it last year and we're looking at it 2 years ago. This is going to combine the formulas that we've used for the regular 28-day time period of the current year. So we're going to use that, and we're actually going to mash that together with our year-to-date formula. So our current 28 days as a reference point is our date dynamic cell -27 as the lower date boundary, and our date dynamic cell itself as the upper date boundary. We're going to combine that using the year with the year, month, day, where we have -1 for the previous year and -2 for 2 years prior. So what that looks like is I'm going to take my prior year to date formula. I'm going to copy that over as my basis because again, I don't want to start this from scratch. And instead of saying 1/1 of that year, I'm going to take the month from my date dynamic cell. And then instead of 1 that was our January 1st day, I'm going to take my date dynamic cell and subtract 27. So I'm just expanding out year, month, and day with my date range itself of that -27. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing for my upper date boundary, where I have the year -1 up until that day. Again, we'll just copy that over to our 2020 column. And instead of -1, we simply change that to a -2 on both ends, our upper and our lower date boundary. And again, as I've stated multiple times, you can copy that down the column, change the offense codes, and now you've completed all of those date ranges. The last item within this is percent change. Now, there is a lot of discretion in how you would want percent change to be represented. At a standard point, percent change is new minus old over old. However, oftentimes analysts will use a if error statement. So for example, if that's an undefined, where we have a 0 as our denominator, you may use an if error statement, which is represented at the bottom right of the slide, where you have that new minus old divided by old. If that errors out, put in an a dash, whatever symbol you may choose. However, in this example, I'm actually going to be using a little bit more of a complex percent change formula. Again, we'll have the slides up at the end that you can access. You should be able to copy and paste out of the Canva into your Excel, and then you'll just replace the new and the old text with the associated cells. So this percent change formula looks at if it is going to be undefined, we're actually going to represent that with an up arrow or a down arrow and the count. So rather than just having NA or a dash in our percent change column, it's going to be represented with an arrow and the count. So if it went from 0 to 5, there'll be an up arrow that it went up 5. If it went from 5 to 0, there'll be a down arrow where it went down 5. So you'll see what that looks like here in a moment. But representing how I would apply this formula, I would just copy and paste this in to my formula bar, and then I'm simply deleting out the text of new, replacing it with my cell values. So as I started out with, we have our color coding when we select and create our different functions in Excel. So you can see, obviously, I have my blue and my red cells. It's making it much easier to see what I'm selecting here. And these are just symbols that I've copied from the internet. If you wanted that arrow to look differently, you can simply copy from Google a different symbol that you wanted, but you can insert that into any Excel formula that you write. So at this point, I can just press enter, and then I've already have some conditional formatting applied, so that's why you're seeing it come up green, but nonetheless, you're seeing what that value looks like. As I just mentioned, I do have some conditional formatting applied. So if the cell value contains a 0%, it's going to be green with green text. If it has a downward facing arrow, it's also going to be green. again, representing a decrease. Again, going back to my example where we went from 5 to 0, that would be representing a decrease, and so therefore it's represented in green. And if the cell value itself is less than or equal to 0%, it would also be represented as green, so anything negative. So any decrease in crime that we're observing on our stat sheet would have that green color. Now, if it is greater than 0, we're going to represent it as red, just showing kind of an indicator that that has increased. Again, these colors are entirely optional. You can choose completely different colors. I know some analysts choose alternatives to red and green for those that may be experiencing color blindness. So you can pick different colors, but the concept behind the rules here are the primary takeaways. And so then this is ultimately that finished product. So we've completed these basically utilizing two different operations in Excel. So we had the sum that we started out with, and then we moved over to COUNTIFs. We wrote one single COUNTIF formula from scratch, and from there it was just a matter of copying over to the different columns and then copying it down the rows and modifying them for the different offense codes. Lastly, we had our percent change that we copied out of the Canva into Excel and modified accordingly. And as I mentioned with that percent change, you'll see some of those different arrows represented. So in that first section of the template, we have the previous 14 to the current 14-day time frame. And if you look down at the theft of motor vehicle parts, you'll see that in the previous 14 days, it was 2. In the current 14 days, it's a 0. And so it has a down arrow of 2. The other takeaway here that I want to mention is that you'll notice in the template that will show up on the screen here in a few moments that the headings are also date dynamic. Now you could choose just to type into those cells biweekly property offenses and the date range. You could choose to type that in every time you updated this. However, you'll notice that those text values are actually date dynamic as well. And they're just concatenations of text as well as references, again, to our date dynamic cell. So this spreadsheet actually updates entirely based on whatever's in that date dynamic cell when new data comes in. So it's saying up to date as of, when you open it up, it'll say today's value. Again, this is a mock data set, so it's saying 8/7/2022. The next thing I want to touch on here is in reference to macros. So ultimately at this point, we've completed the template. So this template is referring to data that's being brought in from Microsoft Access. However, we don't typically want to output our finished product in a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. Typically, the way that I recommend that analysts output this is that they select the cell range that they're interested in, and then they PDF this. So basically Control P to open up the print screen and then say Microsoft PDF to print. The other option you have is to have that entire process be completed with a macro. Now you can put in a VBA script. The card program we've talked about at different conferences, how you can utilize ChatGPT to help write code for some of these things. But otherwise, within Microsoft Excel, you can actually record a macro itself. And so this macro is basically just going to include the steps for refreshing in Excel and printing it to a PDF. So on the developer screen, you do have to enable developer tools. I'm going to record a macro. I'm just selecting the cells I want to print, and I'm following the steps to print this to PDF. I'm only printing my selection, and then I'm going to print that and save it as the PDF. Now, depending on your machine, you may run into a few different issues. So up here on the screen, I do have a screenshot from the Microsoft Visual Basics window that has what that macro actually looks like. So you could always type this into your own machine if you needed to. The only things you'd have to modify here would be the range. So in this example, it's A1 to T1 that you'll notice in the macro. You can modify that, and then you also need to modify the path of where this is ultimately outputting. So you'll notice here it says A Bruner for my desktop. You would modify that to be your desktop. Some examples of some continued learning. Within the template, you'll also notice the ability to create different rolling timelines. There's a sample here on the left. The card program can always put out some additional educational content in the future as the webinar series continues. But that's another example of how you can continue to automate the production of analytical visuals. And on the right, if you want to take this entire process one step further, you can utilize Windows Task Scheduler. So essentially, as the process exists right now, once you have that ODBC established, you have those queries built in Microsoft Access. I used a select query today, and I brought that data into Microsoft Excel. All I had to do was go into Excel and click refresh to bring in new data. And then I had a macro that could execute a PDF. If we want that to all execute by itself, you could utilize Windows Task Scheduler, where it would open up that Excel spreadsheet. It would click refresh for you by executing that macro, which would export the PDF. And without any clicks of a button, you could have all of your Compstat spreadsheets output as PDF onto your designated folder on your machine. So for example, if you wanted to come into the office every Monday and at 8 a.m. that ran, you'd have that there available to disseminate to command or whoever else in your agency. The last couple things here, the template itself, you'll notice has a couple different pages in it. So there is a biweekly stats template that breaks down a little bit more information. You'll see it has some of the other offense codes in here. You can create as many rows as you want. There's also a monthly stats template in there as well. This is pretty much identical in formula structure. They're just modified slightly to be the beginning and end of each month. So this is an example, say, for regular monthly meetings that you may have. This is another example of a product that you might want to put out. There is a rolling timeline template in here where you can enter data. There is an example template, just doesn't have any data loaded into it, a tab where you can load your data in, and then there's also a tab that speaks about some of the formulas we've talked about today. So you'll see a breakdown of percent change using that up and down arrow. You'll also see a breakdown of the count of formula, and then you'll see those associated VBA scripts for biweekly and monthly if you wanted to export to a PDF with a macro. That's all going to be contained in the template that we'll have a link to here momentarily. The template is also embedded in the Canva that you can interact with. It's just stored in a Google Drive. And then again, this is just again a finished version. The idea is that you're able to take that template from the Google Drive, change the colors, add a patch, add your own data, and then you'll have this product. So this is an example from another car site, the Blacksburg Police Department in Virginia. And their analyst, Courtney Carreri, was able to take this template and add additional rows to it. So you'll see at the bottom, it has forcible sexual offenses as well as assault offenses broken down, traffic crashes, and so forth. You can continue to expand this as needed based on what you're looking for at your agency. And then these are some different resources. So the first QR code is going to be a link to the slides. The second QR code is going to be a link to that template in the Google Drive. The third is a recording that's already been published through the Carolinas Crime Analysis Association. If you're interested in viewing that recording right away. As Caitlin mentioned at the beginning, a recording of today's webinar will also be posted to the Crime Analyst in Residence Program website, which is the last and fourth QR code up here on the screen. Will take you to that. And then on the next page, I'll move it to it here in a moment. It has my email address as well as a QR code to my LinkedIn. If you have any specific questions about applying the template, any technical issues, questions specific to your agency on getting access to your data, I'm more than happy to assist. Otherwise, you can reach out to the Crime Analyst in Residence Program through our website. We do have a general email that you're also able to write in for. All right, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap for a few questions. So I'm going to come out of this to see if I can get to the chat. All right, so one of the questions that I have received is in reference to if we have any training with ProPhoenix and Power BI. We don't have any specific training through the CAR program at this time specific on Power BI for that. However, I do believe that the next session is actually going to be on Power BI. Caitlin, correct me if I'm wrong there.
Oh, you are correct.
So that next session is going to be on Power BI in general. There'll also be some resources provided in that webinar for different RMS systems. It won't be specific to ProPhoenix, but it will have some other information in there that may be helpful. Another question here is, can this be used without Microsoft Access? Currently working on trying to get Microsoft Access. So we have ran into issues with different sites. You can always query your data through Microsoft SQL Studio. You could bring in data straight into Power BI if you had that. But this example today is just based off of that Microsoft Access option. Yes, and then Charlie just added in here, you can connect Microsoft Excel directly to the backend of your database using that same ODBC. It's just going to bring in each table independently. So your tables will be represented on different sheets rather than all being on one sheet when it's brought in. So you'll be kind of using Excel as a view within Access, if that makes any sense. All right, with that, I think that Caitlin, myself, and Charlie will stay on for a few minutes if there's any other questions, but otherwise I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin for any closing remarks.
Awesome, yes, thanks, Amanda. So thank you all for joining our session today. Special thank you to Amanda for sharing her time and her expertise. We hope that you found this session helpful and inspiring. Please don't forget to complete the short evaluation form that will be sent out momentarily. We truly do value your feedback. The recording of this webinar will be up on our website early next week. A link to our website will be sent out along with the evaluation form. And like Amanda mentioned, we do look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar in July. It's titled An Introduction to Power BI Data Modeling. Actually, Charlie will be our presenter for that presentation. So we will be sending out information for that momentarily. So until then, thank you. And like Amanda said, we'll stay on for a few minutes for any additional questions. Thank you.